When I stood at their door, trembling hands and a feeling that something inside me had long since died, I still couldn't understand why I had come back. Perhaps it was for the illusion of reconciliation, the hope that the past could heal. But deep down, I felt it was more complicated. Behind that door lay the truth I had been running from all my life, and each step toward it felt like a leap into an abyss. I pressed the doorbell, and the silence around me seemed to grow louder. Would something change, or would I hear that voice again, the one that would make me a stranger in my own family? My name is Kelly. I'm 22, and I've been living on my own for 4 years. From the moment I left my parents' house right after graduating high school, I hadn't returned. At first, it was tough. I couldn't rely on any help from my family, but over time, I learned to handle challenges on my own. I set up a small apartment for myself, found a job, and gradually settled into the rhythm of adult life. It's not a luxurious life, but it's one I chose, and I'm proud of that. I learned to be independent, and while I sometimes missed warmth and support, I still felt I was on the right path. And yet, here I was, standing at the doorstep of the house where I grew up. Today was the day my younger sister Amy was celebrating her 18th birthday. My mother had invited me, and even though I hadn't been in touch with them for a long time, I decided to come, if only for Amy's sake. We weren't close, but maybe this could be a moment of reconciliation. Or at least a chance to remember that we had once been a family. However, as soon as I crossed the threshold, I realized I had been wrong in my expectations. My mother greeted me with a strained smile, her eyes avoiding mine as if trying to hide something she didn't want me to see. Amy, standing beside her, didn't even acknowledge me with a glance. She only smirked and said, "As soon as a woman gets married, she's no longer part of the family. Parties are for family members, so you should leave." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I tried to muster some kind of response, but they spoke with such certainty, such coldness, that I had nothing to say. I never imagined that my own relatives could treat me this way. That coldness. It wasn't just a normal, distant attitude. It was open hostility. My mother stood there, and although her words were gentler, they were enough to make it clear she was on Amy's side. I was an outsider. My chest tightened as if an invisible hand was squeezing me. Pain shot through me, but I quickly composed myself. I couldn't let myself break. This moment was too important, not for them, but for me. I had to endure. If this was how they saw me, there was only one thing I could do. I would make them regret the way they treated me. No tears, no weakness. Let them see that I wasn't afraid. I turned and headed for the door as if I had no reason to stay. My mother didn't try to stop me, and I hadn't expected her to. She simply watched me leave in silence. Amy didn't say a word either. With their silent consent, I walked out. Even as I stood on the steps outside the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just that I wasn't loved, I wasn't wanted. I was a stranger in my own family. Yet despite everything, I had no regrets. For years of solitude had taught me so much. I had learned to earn my own way, to stand on my own 2 feet, to be independent. And now I knew I could be strong. Maybe I wouldn't ever be close to this family. Maybe their love would never be what I wanted it to be. But I didn't have to conform to their rules and expectations. If they wanted me to be an outsider, then I would be, on my own terms. When I returned to my apartment, all I wanted was to relax and process everything that had happened. I turned on the light in my small room, putting my things back in their places, as if this act alone restored some control over my life. But the memories, as I knew they would, wouldn't let me go. My mother and Amy weren't forgotten. Their words continued to echo in my mind, reverberating over and over again. It seemed like I could tell myself that their words no longer hurt me, that I had learned to ignore them. But was that true? What if I had become so accustomed to their coldness that I could no longer imagine what it would be like if it ever changed? Perhaps their behavior was so familiar that I had learned to live with it. Yet despite that, deep down, the thoughts still tormented me. How I wished things could be different. That I wasn't a stranger. Some time passed before I started to focus on myself again. 2 days ago, while preparing for work, I noticed a letter from my mother in my mailbox. A letter bearing her last name, handwritten. I hadn't opened it yet, but I knew that when I did, it would only be to prove to myself that I could handle whatever they had to say. It was in my control. Once, back when I was still living in the house with my mother and Amy, my younger sister innocently asked a seemingly harmless question: "Why doesn't Kelly have a birthday party?" In that moment, I felt a genuine spark of hope, as if a ray of light had pierced through years of darkness. Maybe my mom actually cared about me? After all, it's not hard to arrange something as simple and human as a birthday celebration. It takes so little, just a bit of attention and understanding. My heart filled with an unfamiliar warmth, almost a childlike expectation that things might change. But that brief moment of hope quickly dissolved with what I heard next. My mom simply brushed it off, as if the question was a waste of time, and said she was too busy. Amy's words lingered, haunting me. In that moment, I realized there was no place for me in their world. My mom didn't care about me. She just stayed in her usual role, and it seemed that fulfilling Amy's needs mattered more to her than fairness or equality. That realization clenched my heart and left me struggling for breath. Over time, Amy began looking at me differently. Her gaze grew more mocking and condescending. During family celebrations, I was almost always left on the sidelines. When the celebratory cakes were brought out, Amy always got her slice, but I wasn't given even a crumb. Everyone around was preoccupied with themselves, and I remained a stranger in that house. With each passing year, my attempts to fit in grew more desperate. I tried to please them, made efforts to bridge the gap, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't become part of their world. I was alien, like an awkward piece in a mechanism that continued to function without me. When I entered high school, I realized things couldn't go on like this. But despite my efforts, my mother didn't support me financially. She never thought it necessary to help me pay for school. That was the final blow. I didn't complain or ask for help. I simply took responsibility for my own future in silence. That's how I ended up in a vocational school, where I studied and worked to support myself. Working outside the home was at least better than staying in that house, where I was nothing more than an unwelcome guest. I learned to be independent, hardened by my determination to survive. Yet despite my efforts, home was the only place I could return to. Even if I disliked the air within those walls, even if I was rejected, I couldn't detach myself from my past. My mother never acknowledged my efforts. She didn't see me, no matter how hard I tried to break free from her indifference. Everything I did felt meaningless. It was like taking tiny steps that disappeared into the vast void of her silence. Sometimes, I thought that even if I tried to change something, she wouldn't notice. I began to believe that my achievements would never matter to her. And so, at 18, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in a place where I wasn't welcome anymore. I couldn't remain part of a family that didn't consider me one of their own. In a single moment, I understood that my place wasn't there. I needed to leave. I needed to choose freedom. I wanted to be myself, free from the suffocating shadow that constantly loomed over me. I packed my things and left. There were no tears, no farewells. I simply closed the door behind me. I needed to live my life solely for myself, by my own rhythm, under my own rules. On the day I left home, I felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom bloom within me. I could be myself. I could move forward, toward my life, toward my independence. I no longer meant anything to them. And I didn't feel guilty about it. There wasn't the faintest spark of regret. I had become a woman who no longer needed anyone's validation or approval. I wasn't a daughter or a sister. I was Kelly, a woman shaping her own destiny. Amy and my mother stayed behind, in their world, in their dream. And I moved forward. I stood in front of the door, holding a cake box, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. So many years had passed since I last stepped into that house, and here I was again, determined not to let the past dictate the rules of my life anymore. I had decided I wouldn't let them control me. But how difficult it was to erase what was in your blood, your history, in every look, every word, every gesture. All those years spent in solitude still couldn't completely heal the pain they had caused me. With each step I took toward the door, my nervousness grew. I had bought a cake and a gift for Amy, despite everything that had happened between us. I couldn't let our past define everything. Her 21st birthday was a significant milestone, and despite all the hatred that might divide us, I still wanted to congratulate her. It wasn't for them, it was for me, to prove to myself that I could rise above the situation. I hadn't come to ask for forgiveness. I had come to say that I could be present if I wanted to, even if they didn't deserve it. When I rang the doorbell, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if each chime was a punishment. I knew their reaction would be cold, that they would avoid me or at least act as if I wasn't someone they had ever known. Yet I remained standing on that doorstep, waiting for an answer. "Who's there?" came Amy's mocking voice, with that same tone that made me feel alien. "Amy, it's me." "Stop joking. I brought a cake." "Open the door," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. A moment of silence. I didn't know what to expect. And then, with a loud creak, the door abruptly opened. Amy stood on the threshold, her expression neutral, her eyes showing neither joy nor disappointment. Without a word, she snatched the cake box from my hands, as if I were merely an irritating object to be cleared from her path. Before I could comprehend what was happening, she forcefully threw the box back at me. The cake splattered across the floor, the frosting spreading like a dirty stain on the worn carpet. I stood there, stunned, unable to believe my eyes. Consumed by the moment, I froze, and something inside me broke. So many years had passed, yet they hadn't changed. This wasn't just humiliation, it was blatant disdain. Once again, I was nothing to them. My chest tightened, and I felt the cold, the alienation they had always surrounded me with, closing in once more. I tried to understand why this was happening, why they acted this way, but I couldn't find an answer. I stood there, unable to move, feeling my energy drain with every passing second. The cake I had brought was ruined, along with my attempt to rebuild even a semblance of a relationship. Amy stood before me, her gaze just as mocking and condescending as it had been when she last spoke about family. I felt so hollow I couldn't utter a word. I had expected some reaction, even the smallest one, to show that this wasn't merely an act of cruelty on her part. But there was nothing. It was all the same as always. "Are you out of your mind?" I said, trying to gather myself. I wanted to yell, but my words came out hollow, as if they were unnecessary. Amy looked at me, then casually turned and walked back into the house, paying me no attention. I remained standing there, unable to move. The sense of resentment and humiliation filled me to the brim, and suddenly I realized that in this moment, they didn't care about me at all. They didn't even try to hide how little my visit, my feelings, or my efforts mattered to them. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen like a statue. I could hear sounds coming from inside the house, conversations, laughter, but none of it mattered anymore. I was just a remnant of the past they had left behind, an unnecessary link they could part with without regret. At some point, I turned and walked back to the door, no longer feeling pain or anger. I just walked. I walked because I knew this moment was yet another futile attempt to reclaim what could no longer be restored. I stood before the door, my hand holding the cake box trembling slightly. The pleasant excitement I had initially felt vanished, replaced by emptiness and a cold fear. I didn't even realize when I had stepped closer and rung the bell. As I waited for a response, it felt as if fate itself was forcing me to kneel before those I had so desperately tried to bring back into my life. And then, when the door opened, I felt my inner world collapse. Amy stood before me, her face cold, her eyes mocking, as if she expected me to do something ridiculous. Her voice, cold and indifferent, cut through the silence. "You're here again. Why? You're not part of this family anymore. Get lost." She abruptly snatched the cake box from my hands, as if it were the most useless and repugnant object, and without a word, hurled it back at me. The cake burst apart on the floor in an instant, like a shattered memory of my belief in this family. Time seemed to stop, and everything around me became blurry and alien. I stood in shock, motionless, unable to move. Amy's gaze remained unchanged, mocking, even gloating. She stood in the doorway, not inviting me in, not saying another word. And in that moment, as I saw the cake lying at my feet, its frosting spreading like a stain, a symbol of everything I had tried so hard to restore, I realized the awful truth. My hand fell, the box slipping from my fingers. "Aren't you going to answer?" Amy said, her words echoing in my head. "Leave, stranger." That was it. The moment I understood that all this time, I had been trying to reclaim something that had never truly existed. I didn't belong to this family. I had never been anyone to them, even when I thought I might matter. In that moment, I felt my heart constrict, and bitter tears welled up, but I held them back. I didn't need to pity myself. When the door slammed shut with such force it felt as though my entire life had been consumed by that sound, I realized I had been wrong. I had been clinging to a false hope all this time. I had wanted to believe that something could change, that I could find a place in their lives. But I was an outsider and had always been one. There was no point in wasting any more time trying to find my place in their world, a world in which I had never belonged. At that moment, I finally understood that home isn't where you were born. Home is where you are loved and wanted. I turned and walked away, not looking back. But this step was a decision. I would no longer fight to fit into a life that was never mine. I had a place where I truly belonged. My husband, Don, was waiting for me at home. He had become my real home, the person with whom I could build my life without looking back. We had met through a mutual friend. It happened completely by chance, and perhaps that's how it was meant to be. At first, I couldn't believe that someone as grown up and independent as him could love me. I never thought I would get married. I thought I didn't have the right to a family, that all I had around me were remnants of the past. But Don accepted me for who I was. He didn't ask about my parents, didn't judge me for the lack of perfect family ties in my life. He was simply there. He didn't protest when I told him how my relationship with my family had fallen apart, how every look from them left scars on my soul. He listened, supported me, and I realized that this is what love should be. Without judgment. Without coercion. Just understanding and a desire to be together. I didn't need to try to bring them back into my life. Don had shown me that it wasn't about how you were born, but how you could love and be loved. And now, as I thought about all of this, I realized that I had finally found my path. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I broke away from my thoughts, which had started to torment me again, and despite everything that had happened earlier, I went to the door. My heart began to beat faster. When I opened it, Amy was standing there. Amy? I couldn't hide my surprise. How did she find my address? She, as always, wasn't shy about her behavior. Her gaze was full of playful confidence, as if she had come to visit an old acquaintance, not bothering to explain why she had decided to show up. Despite everything that had happened between us, I simply stepped aside and said, "What are you doing here?" Amy didn't hurry to respond, Her smile was just as sharp and mocking as ever. "I just wanted to see what kind of guy you married," she said, her tone filled with playful bewilderment that immediately felt icy. I could have replied that she already knew who my husband was, but I remained silent because I suddenly realized she hadn't come to see me. This was part of something else, something hidden that I couldn't understand. As soon as she entered the living room, her eyes swept across the room, searching for something, judgment, scorn, and immediately settled on Dawn. I felt the tension in the air thicken. Amy cast an appraising glance at my husband, and her words seemed deliberately sharp, meant to wound. "So, this is your husband? Not bad. How did someone like you manage to catch him?" I froze. Anger bubbled within me, but I couldn't contain the surge of emotion. Time seemed to stand still. I tried to find the right words to respond, but Don had heard enough. He remained calm and composed as always, unfazed by the sting in her remark. "Amy, I'd appreciate it if you refrained from making unnecessary comments," he said, his voice carrying a rare firmness that I deeply valued. He wasn't going to let her taint the moment or insult me, even if that was her usual style. Amy paused for a moment, her usual confidence faltering slightly. She seemed surprised by Dawn's directness, but quickly regained her composure. Her smile grew even sweeter, but her eyes still held a flicker of contempt. She approached Dawn and extended her hand with a pained smile, trying to further unsettle me. "Don't be so stiff, let's have some fun." "Kelly won't mind," she said, her voice soft but laced with a clear undercurrent of mockery. Her words burned me. I had lost count of how many times I tried to ignore her behavior, to turn a blind eye to how she treated me and my life, but she always managed to rekindle that strange, painful effect. Don seemed to know exactly how to handle situations like this. He accepted her handshake, but his gaze was steady, and the smile he returned was restrained enough to let her know her antics wouldn't work here. "I don't think that's a good idea, Amy. We're not looking for fun of that sort," he said, and I felt my confidence return. He had always been my rock, even when the world around me felt alien. Amy seemed to realize that her attempts to manipulate and cling to old, broken ties wouldn't bear fruit. She stepped back, her dazzling smile fading, though her eyes still held the same cold calculation. "Fine, fine," she said, unsure of how to proceed. "But don't think I came here for you. I just wanted to see what you've become. Maybe you're not who you used to be." Her words stung again, but I understood that they didn't matter. She had come here to dig into a past long gone, failing to see that her manipulations and games no longer worked. I was no longer the girl she could boss around, manipulate, or make feel like an outsider. My life was here, with Dawn, and her attempts to drag me back into the world I once believed in were futile. At last, I felt that I had found my place, and it wasn't in her world. Relief washed over me long after Amy left our home. It was clear she hadn't come for reconciliation or to mend relationships. She had come to remind me of the place she believed I no longer deserved. But now, with the door shut behind her and her footsteps fading, I felt it all drifting away, like smoke disappearing into the night. With each day, with every moment, the struggle and the pain were fading. A month later, I continued living in the world I had built for myself, morning coffee, work, quiet evenings with Dawn, simply enjoying the peace. Everything seemed unchanged, calm, measured, and I didn't think anyone could disrupt my life again with such a storm. I hoped it was over, that I had left it all behind. But one day, when I had almost forgotten those days in their house, there came a loud knock on the door. I got up to answer, not expecting anything good. Standing before me were my mother and Amy, their faces twisted with anger. Judging by their expressions, this was no casual visit. My mother barely gave me a chance to speak before blurting out, "Why hasn't the tuition payment gone through? The landlord is threatening eviction. We don't understand you at all, Kelly." I knew this moment would come eventually. I had anticipated this confrontation, this new wave of reproaches and accusations. But none of it mattered anymore. I no longer felt the attachment that had once compelled me to make concessions, to apologize, to seek forgiveness. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure, and calmly replied, "I stopped the payments because I'm no longer responsible for you." I felt the weight of those words in my heart, but there was no anger or regret in them, just the clarity that it was time to draw a line in these relationships. My mother froze, and Amy's face flickered with surprise, almost confusion. I continued, "I even sold the house to reclaim what I've already paid you. I'm not going to keep living in this debt. I don't owe you anything anymore." Her face changed. My mother tried to muster something resembling understanding, but instead, her eyes filled with anger and bewilderment. She stepped closer to me, as if trying to lend more weight to her words. "What do you mean you sold the house? Do you even realize what you're saying? We gave you everything, and you're just wiping your feet on us." I felt something long suppressed rise within me, but I kept my composure. I can't say it didn't hurt. After all, despite everything, this woman is my mother. And perhaps in her cruelty, there was something material that, at times, made me feel that she was my support. But now I knew that wasn't the case. All she had done for me was part of a game, one in which I had long stopped being a winner. I quietly responded, "You made it clear that I'm no longer part of your family. So, I'm not obligated to support you. And this doesn't apply to just you. I won't support a family that doesn't accept me." In that moment, my mother was at a loss for words. Amy, standing next to her, stared at me openly, her expression a mixture of anger and dissatisfaction. She clearly hadn't expected me to say it aloud. Amy, as always, was certain that her place in the family was untouchable, that she would remain relevant no matter what. But this time, I refused to stay in the shadow of her confidence. "You can't do this after everything we've done for you," she finally shouted. "You can't just walk away from us." I looked at her with a quiet but firm expression. Every word I spoke seemed to echo in her mind, resounding and undeniable. I didn't need to justify myself, I didn't need to apologize. I had long realized that my place was no longer with them. I didn't owe any explanations as to why I shouldn't help them, why I wasn't obligated to comply with their demands, their orders, their rules. And though I couldn't tell her everything that was on my mind, I had no doubt about my choice. I took a step back, closing the door in front of their faces, a door that separated me from the past I no longer wanted to be a part of. At last, I felt free. These words, seemingly so simple, brought me relief like a long-awaited breath of air after years of confinement. The persecution had ceased, and life regained that peaceful harmony I had long dreamed of. My mother's and Amy's constant interference had drained me emotionally. Every encounter, every glance, felt like a blow I couldn't deflect. But now, I could move on, without looking back, without the internal tension that once paralyzed all my actions. Dawn and I settled into our new home. It wasn't too large, but it was cozy and filled with light. Here, we were creating our life anew, focusing on building our future together. Everything we had once experienced remained in the past. Now our home was our sanctuary, and every morning began with a smile and a soft, "Good morning." In every glance, in every gesture of Dawn, I felt care and understanding. His love and support had become the foundation upon which I began to rebuild myself. My new family, Dawn's relatives, became the ones who helped me heal. They accepted me as I was, without asking unnecessary questions or judging me. They didn't try to evaluate my past experiences, didn't focus on my weaknesses or the pain I carried. They were simply there, and that was enough. Especially his mother, who seemed to sense that I lacked something I hadn't even realized. She told me, "Kelly, your family, no matter what happens, will always be there for you. These words sounded like a promise, like a shield I could take up at any moment. And I realized that I had finally found what I had been missing: real support, without conditions and without pain. I felt protected like never before. Of course, it was hard to forget those I had grown up with, but I knew that now I had a place in the world, a place where I was truly loved and valued. Meanwhile, my mother's and stepfather's relationship continued to deteriorate rapidly. Without my financial support, their fragile bond was cracking at the seams. My mother, having lost her support, found herself faced with an inevitable choice. And not long ago, I learned that they had divorced. My mother was left alone, unable to restore what had been destroyed. She withdrew into isolation, as if trying to shut herself off from the world, forgetting her role in my life. She tried to survive in the shadow of her past, but this time, without me. Amy, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her own decisions. She seemed to be trying to get everything back, but it was too late. When her fiancé learned about her family history, about me, about all the hidden dark corners she had tried to conceal, her relationship fell apart. He couldn't accept her, couldn't overlook everything she had kept from him. And, of course, Amy couldn't understand why. She had always thought her life was a game in which she would always win. But reality turned out to be much harsher than she had ever imagined. Left alone, Amy was confronted with a reality she didn't know how to deal with. She fought, trying to find support, but her habit of manipulating people, her detachment from true emotions, ultimately left her alone with the consequences of her actions. She tried to return to my life, once again seeking recognition and forgiveness, but I had long since realized that I couldn't be the person who would always save her. She had to learn to face her problems on her own. In the end, each of us is responsible for our own life. And here I stood, in this house, with Don by my side, with his family, in this new world I had built for myself. I couldn't help but think about how much I had changed. The moment Amy and my mother left my life, I felt like I could finally be myself. Not the Kelly who constantly dragged behind the weight of the past, not the one who sought approval from people who never valued her. I was free, at last. I had found my independence, not just external, but internal as well. I didn't know what the future would bring, but now, with this new sense of peace and self-confidence, I was ready to face it. And whatever happened, I knew one thing: I would no longer let the past control my future.